Hello, and welcome to Politics for the People. I'm your host, Michael Striano. Thanks for listening and joining in the conversation. You can find links to our Patreon and Instagram in the show notes and sign up for our weekly newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts to help others find the show. Okay, let's get to it. Our topic today, gerrymandering. It's one of those words like filibuster. The first time you hear it, you think it can't possibly be real. Goofy as the name may be, the practice is anything but funny. But what is it? How does it work? Why is it so common, and why should we care? A quick note, I reference our last episode on redistricting several times throughout this episode, because gerrymandering really is a part of the redistricting process. If you missed last week's episode, it might be a good idea to go back and listen to that first. Okay, back to it. As always, let's start with a definition. Gerrymandering is the practice of manipulating district lines to give one candidate an undue advantage. Since it's tied to redistricting, gerrymandering can be done for both local and congressional districts, but we'll focus on congressional, so who serves in the U.S. House of Representatives. The practice of gerrymandering has existed since practically the birth of the United States. The name is from 1812, when the governor of Massachusetts, Jerry Elbridge, signed a map into law containing a district many thought looked like a salamander. His name was combined with the word, and the gerrymander was born. So, what is gerrymandering? One important thing to keep in mind as we talk about gerrymandering is it's only possible in a winner-take-all system. When we vote for who will represent us in the House, we cast a ballot for one candidate, and whomever receives a majority of votes, whether it's by 1 or 1,000, is declared the winner. This may seem like an obvious detail now, and you're probably wondering why I brought it up, but just keep it in mind as we go through the episode. Gerrymandering generally takes place for one of two reasons: protecting incumbents or partisanship. When maps are drawn to protect incumbents, the process is surprisingly bipartisan. Regardless of party, everyone wants to keep their job. So candidates and their parties take steps to protect themselves from potential challenges. In our redistricting episode, I mentioned the example of the exact block where then State Senator Barack Obama lived being removed from his district after a close primary race. The map was redrawn with surgical precision to prevent Obama from repeating his challenge. The process was manipulated to ensure job security for the incumbent politician, rather than forcing him to genuinely win the votes of his constituents. This is a perfect example of the kind of gerrymandering which is blind to party and more concerned with cementing incumbents in their seats. A partisan gerrymander is more familiar, and probably what you think of when someone mentions the word. Here, maps are drawn to significantly over or underrepresent one party in the state delegation, regardless of the spread of votes. The founding father John Adams said in 1788 that the House should be an exact portrait and a miniature of the population as a whole, which makes sense when you consider some of the House's functions as laid out by the Constitution: draft and pass legislation, and, if we have a contingent election, choose the next president, as we talked about in our episode on the Electoral College. Maybe the best way to tell the importance our founding fathers placed on the House is the line of succession, or who is in charge should the president not be able to do their job. We all know the vice president is next in line, but after them, the responsibility falls to the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House is a congressperson chosen by their fellow representatives to lead, but they're a normal congressperson elected by their district every 2 years. In our episode on redistricting, I spoke about how America is a republic, and nowhere is that more evident than here. The people elect a representative, and if the executive branch is no longer able to serve, that representative becomes president. This is why congressional representation is so important, and anything that might influence those elections, such as gerrymandering, is such a serious matter. Imagine something happens and both the president and the vice president are unable to do their jobs. The new president is someone who is elected by just one district. How terrible would it be if that individual was only in Congress because of a gerrymandered district? Our president wouldn't have been chosen by the people. In fact, they would have been elected by a map that was carefully designed to keep the people from choosing. So, how does it work? We already discussed protecting incumbents, which is fairly straightforward, but let's take a closer look at partisan gerrymanders. The goal here is to secure as many seats in the state delegation as possible, regardless of the number of actual votes a party or candidate receives. The basic idea behind doing that is to carefully either spread out or bring together as many of the party's votes as possible. This is where having a winner-take-all system really comes into play. This type of partisan gerrymandering has become so common, it has a name: packing and cracking. It's a system that has been used with amazing effectiveness to dilute the votes of the opposition party and ensure the party in control retains their outsized majority. The two terms refer to packing as many opposition voters as possible into as few districts as possible, or cracking those same voters, spreading them among as many different districts as possible, ensuring they'll never have enough votes to win the district by diluting their power. For some context, we talked about a good example of packing in last week's episode on redistricting, where in Texas, a massive district was created, spanning hundreds of miles to pile as many Republican voters as possible into one district. Known examples of cracking are common around major U.S. cities, where sections of the largely Democratic cities are used to balance out the more Republican suburbs. Districts like these contain enough of the urban population to easily outweigh the suburban or rural populations. One type of gerrymandering we should mention that's not largely seen anymore is racial, but that's only because of the Supreme Court. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 says no one can abridge the right of any citizen of the United States to vote based on color. But it was all too common for congressional maps to contain majority-minority districts, packing the votes of non-white citizens into as few districts as possible and reducing their influence in Congress. However, there have been arguments made in favor of majority-minority districts, and some do still exist today. For one, it prevents the practice of cracking minority votes and diluting them so they're effectively meaningless, and has allowed for an increased non-white presence in Congress. In 2001, the ACLU looked at the numbers and found that the total number of black elected officials had increased from just 300 in 1964 to 8,858 in 1998. Today, there are still some majority-minority districts, but they exist more as partisan gerrymanders because, speaking in generalizations, non-white Americans tend to vote for Democrats. As I said earlier, the Supreme Court found racial gerrymanders to be in violation of the law, but have ruled multiple times they have no jurisdiction over partisan gerrymanders. Some notable rulings have said that partisan gerrymanders present political questions beyond the jurisdiction of the court, and Chief Justice John Roberts' recent writings stated that for the court to take a stance on political gerrymanders, a limited and precise standard would be needed that was clear, manageable, and politically neutral. So the Supreme Court hasn't ruled out the possibility of ruling against political gerrymanders. They just say they haven't been given context in which to do it. Instead, they've said it's a political matter, to be resolved by the states and Congress by passing legislation. There are some examples, like Pennsylvania, where the state Supreme Court threw out the congressional map based on that state's constitution. The subsequent election in 2018 saw Democrats achieve significant gains in the state's congressional delegation. So why should we care? How does this affect the lives of normal everyday Americans? It's something we touched on last episode, but really comes into play here. Voter disenfranchisement. We've all heard or felt ourselves that our votes don't matter, with some people even saying it's all predetermined behind closed doors. This is what they mean. The essence of any gerrymander is to ensure one candidate or party wins, regardless of what the voters actually want. The Center for American Progress, an independent, nonpartisan organization, conducted a study of partisan favoritism in the redistricting process and found that of the 435 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, 59 were impacted by unfair district lines. That means that 59 House seats have been in some way manipulated to disenfranchise voters, which translates to roughly 42 million Americans. Americans love embracing the idea of competition. It's seen as pushing for better results and more innovation, but our political system, through the use of gerrymandering, has fallen into a pattern of status quo, with fewer and fewer competitive seats. Just looking back at the past decade, the 2010 election saw 70 House seats from competitive districts, which dropped to 53 after the redistricting process in 2011, then to just 47 in 2012. We've been discussing congressional gerrymanders, but just for a minute, let's look at the Wisconsin State Assembly. Members are re-elected every 2 years, and Republicans were in power during the 2011 redistricting process, later winning a supermajority in the chamber, meaning they could do whatever they wanted and no one could stop them. In the 2018 election, Republicans retained their supermajority in the chamber despite Democrats winning every statewide office. Clearly, voters across the state supported Democrats more than Republicans. And is it possible people voted across party lines to keep the state assembly red? Of course. But in the highly partisan election of 2018, do you know anyone who voted across party lines like that? If you do, how many? In our redistricting episode, I talked about the nature of our democratic republic and the power we put in our elected officials. If you missed it, go back and give it a listen, because it will give this episode the weight it deserves. We can define gerrymandering as manipulating district lines. But what it really is the process of undermining our democracy. When representatives no longer have to answer to the people, then the people no longer have a voice in government. If you feel like your vote doesn't count or the government doesn't work for you, this is a big part of that feeling and a great place to start taking back your power. It starts with participating in the census, then knowing who does the redistricting for your state. Hold those people accountable and let them know you're paying attention by reaching out to their offices or posting about it on social media. If you listened to this episode and didn't like what you heard, then get involved. It's as easy as making a phone call to your state representatives, or even sharing this episode so other people can learn about it too. Thanks for listening, and a special thanks to our patrons on Patreon for your help in making this happen, and all those who have left us a review. Be sure to check out the show notes, where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter and follow us on Instagram at Politics for the People Podcast. Want to help shape the conversation, have a say in episode topics, and get exclusive content, including early access to episodes and live conversations with me? Check the show notes, head on over to our Patreon page, and subscribe for as little as $3. We'll see you Wednesday with our newsletter, and Friday with a brand new episode. Take care.